I'm going to talk some in this video about unemployment and the various types of unemployment. As you might have deduced from the readings, if macroeconomists were to be asked the two most serious problems in macroeconomics, they would probably say inflation on the one hand, unemployment on the other. And we'll come back to inflation a bit later in the semester, particularly when we have a bit more of the technical tools that will allow us to really analyze the causes and impact of inflation. Unemployment, though, we'll talk a bit now about, particularly as it relates to GDP, and this will tie in nicely with our previous discussion about GDP accounting. And so when we talk about unemployment, first of all, we should make clear that economists, unlike those of us in day-to-day speech, would refer to unemployment of any productive resource, not just labor, which is what we tend to think of when we think about unemployment, but also the unemployment of factories. If 18-wheelers are not moving merchandise, that would be unemployment. Factories that are only operating 2 shifts as opposed to 3 shifts, that would be unemployment. And obviously associated with those types of unemployment of capital goods, plant and equipment and things of that nature, would also be labor unemployment. And in many ways, labor unemployment is difficult to deal with. And so we'll talk about unemployment, the various types of it, how it relates to the ups and downs of the business cycle. But first of all, let's define what unemployment is. And so when we talk about the unemployment rate, it's expressed as a percentage, and it's reported about once a month, usually in the beginning of the end of the first week of every month for the prior month, and it's reported by the Labor Department. But where's the number come from? So first of all, it's taking the number of unemployed people divided by the number of people in the labor force. So it's a number divided by number, which is simply some fraction that's going to give you some number then, okay? Obviously, there are always going to be fewer unemployed people than people in the labor force, so it's going to be something less than 1. Obviously, if everyone in the labor force weren't working, it'd be 1, and we'd have times 100 would give us 100% unemployment rate. Obviously, unfortunately, it's less than that. When we talk about the unemployed, there are a number of different ways by which this is computed. There's a household survey that's done asking about who's working in the household. There's a business survey as well. There are people who file for unemployment benefits, and so there are a number of different ways to arrive at the number of unemployed. And when we talk about the people in the labor force, we're talking about, the definition of that is those who are working, even part-time, plus those who are looking for work, and they have to be actively looking. And that might seem to be a bit difficult of an idea. Why would you include those not working in the labor force, when in fact they're clearly not working? In fact, aren't you double counting them if you're putting them in the numerator and the denominator? And the answer the economists would give is the idea that if someone's out of work, they're still really in the labor force as long as they're still actively looking for work and are what we call available for work. That is, if they were offered work today, next week, whatever, that they would accept it. There are those who fall out of the labor force, and we call them discouraged workers, who are no longer working. That's very problematic because we're talking about workers who may be available to work, but we just don't know who they are and whether they truly will come to work, and so we do not include them in the labor force. And then obviously the very old and very young, or anyone who doesn't work. Children obviously are not accounted for in the labor force. 16 and 17-year-olds, oftentimes the unemployment rate is computed differently. It's a whole different set of circumstances for a teen to be unemployed than it is for an adult, and so oftentimes those rates are much higher. But nonetheless, we can account for people who are actually working no matter how many hours per week that they work. Someone who's completely unemployed, or I'm sorry, completely retired, or whatever is out of the labor force. And so if we just take hypothetical numbers, 12 million divided by 100 million, we're going to get some value of 0.12. And if you multiply that by 100, you end up with a percentage, which is how we know the unemployment rate. And that'd be a relatively high unemployment rate, but nonetheless we know that this is the way that we compute that number, and we express it as a percentage. The only reason we multiply it by 100 is to simply move the decimal 2 points to the right in order to express it as a percentage, which is a common way of presenting economic data in percentage terms. Okay? Well, not all unemployment is the same, and so it's important for us to divide up the unemployed by their causes for a couple of reasons, for policy reasons, and to allow us to get a better gauge as to how close we are or are not to full employment. So the first kind of unemployment we're going to call is frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is simply defined as unemployment for a variety of reasons, a hodgepodge of reasons. And it could be things like people simply leaving their jobs, people being terminated involuntarily from their jobs. So voluntary or involuntary unemployment. It could be people who are simply frictionally unemployed because they've left one job, they're going to another. It could include the issue of what are called trailing spouses, which is when one spouse gets a job, maybe in a different locality, the other spouse, and they don't really even have to be married, is frictionally unemployed for the time that that other one, the unemployed person, is able to find work elsewhere. It could also include in this, which is a fairly large category, the seasonally unemployed. Seasonally unemployed people are not surprised that they're going to be seasonally unemployed. Lifeguards know they'll be seasonally unemployed. Ski instructors, certain agricultural workers, certain construction workers, tax preparers, and so we know that this is going to happen. The key thing about frictional unemployment is this, and that is the idea that there is no problem with the economy. There's no problem with the economy, and furthermore, there is no problem with the worker. So the worker is out of work, but it's not considered to be a problem. So no problem with the economy, no problem with the worker, in the case of frictional unemployment. Okay? The second one is a different story, however. Structural unemployment is simply defined as unemployment due to some mismatch between the demand for workers' labor and their supply of them. In other words, firms demanding labor have a different sort of demand than what workers are presenting. Oftentimes this is due to things like outsourcing, where jobs are being shifted elsewhere, and as a result, there's no further demand for certain jobs in the U.S. Or technology has replaced those jobs. Things like robots have taken over a lot of the production work at automotive manufacturers and others, and so as a result, structurally unemployed people are out of work for that reason. Or it could be that simply whatever the job that a person was in is no longer in demand because of various structural, as the word implies, structural changes in the economy. And we've seen over a very long time period jobs disappear. Things like elevator operators and even telephone operators to a large extent. People to pump gasoline. All this has been replaced by various other forms of technology. And so here we can say there's still no problem with the economy, unless of course you believe that this is not technologically progressive. Instead, the problem, and to put this sensitively, the problem is with the worker. The problem is with the worker. And we're not trying to point the finger at the worker here. We're simply saying that the worker needs to make some kind of plan, some kind of adjustment, because it's likely that person will be out of work for a fairly significant period of time. We say there's no problem with the economy because as economies change, as technologies arrive, as different outputs are demanded, different inputs are demanded, including labor inputs, as a result, it is very possible to fall into the position of being structurally unemployed. So when we say problems with the worker, we really mean the burden is with the worker, oftentimes retraining or retooling, finding some other skill is what is necessary. Okay? And then the final one is this. This might be the one that is the most obvious, and that is cyclical unemployment. This is unemployment due to simply the ups and downs of the business cycle, in this case the downs of the business cycle, people being out of work because of a poor economy, poor business conditions. And when this happens, it can affect workers in the public sector, the private sector, in various industries, simply because of the fact that the economy is in not so great a condition. And so here, we're going to say the problem is with the economy. The problem is with the economy, and we're going to say that there is no problem with the worker that we know of. So there's no problem with workers. Okay? So we've now looked at these from the various standpoints and as to their causes, frictionally, structurally, and cyclically unemployed. We've tried to decide where the burden lies. In the case of frictional unemployment, a lot of times frictional unemployment is considered by economists to be no big deal. Not that it's always a great event to be unemployed. That's obviously not the case, but there's nothing that economists can do or the government can do if, for instance, a business closes down, not due to the economy, but just simply because of normal business restructuring. Structurally unemployed, there's no necessary problem with the economy, particularly when we talk about what government policy is supposed to do about it. Not much can be done about the use of robots to replace labor in manufacturing, for example. It's very difficult to know what government could do. So when we talk about policy, as so much in this course, The term policy is to be associated with government policy because government is really the only entity that's capable of dealing with the broader macro issues, problems with the worker. So when I say that the problems with the economy, this is the one that comes to mind as being an important thing for us to know about, because it then leads to what unemployment rate, that is what rate is acceptable. And in other words, what is the full employment rate of unemployment? Something that and that's kind of a mouthful, what is the natural rate of unemployment? In other words, as some percentage. In other words, we are acknowledging as economists that there's always going to be some unemployment. There are always going to be people who are laid off, terminated for various reasons, leave their jobs, choose to be unemployed for a period after maybe graduated from college and are therefore not employed. There's always going to be that. There's always going to be structural unemployment. It's the cyclical element that's an issue. So knowing that there's going to always be frictional and structural, the natural rate of unemployment includes the percentage of the numbers of those not working, who are both frictionally and structurally unemployed. And so in other words, what is the implication of this? If it's just frictional and structural, then we're saying there's zero cyclical unemployment. And that is the upshot. That's how we determine what is the natural or the full employment rate of unemployment, where there is zero cyclical unemployment. That is, and this has implications as to government policy, particularly that which seeks to stabilize the economy and to bring it to full employment. And as to full employment, when we talk about the natural rate of unemployment, unemployment is expressed as a percentage, but it's associated with GDP, which is expressed as a dollar figure. And so when we talk about this association with the dollar figure, then we're talking about a full employment rate of unemployment. And we'll call Y sub FE, full employment rate of unemployment. And, full employment rate of unemployment is the natural rate. This is the full employment GDP. Full employment GDP, which is also known and discussed in your textbook as being potential GDP. Because if full employment is the potential for the economy in terms of employing everybody who wants to work, who's able to find work, and that's really what the natural rate implies, is that everybody who wants to work can find work. There's no cyclical unemployment where there are people who look and can never find work, then that's associated with a level of GDP as a dollar figure that is full employment or also the potential GDP. And where this will lead us in subsequent videos and subsequent chapter readings is the idea of what happens when there's a gap. In other words, when there's a difference between the actual and the potential GDP. And so if the actual GDP differs somehow from the potential GDP, then the result is what we call an output gap. And the output gap that we're most concerned about as relates to unemployment is in the case in which the actual GDP is actually, not only is it not equal, but it's less than the potential GDP. And then we'll talk in numerous cases about what can be done. And there are various number of tools by various agencies of government that are tasked with doing this. That is, in other words, to close the output gap. What can be done so that the potential and actual are equal, and that we're operating at this potential or full employment GDP associated with full employment rate of unemployment that we simply refer to as the natural rate of unemployment. So the number of terms that we've thrown out here, unemployment is expressed as a percentage, GDP is expressed as a dollar figure, but they relate to one another very nicely. And as we go in subsequent class sessions, as well as the readings and the subsequent videos, we'll see how this ties together more in terms of what to do, particularly when we're not at the full employment level of unemployment.